There are things that happen inside the walls of this family that the world is never supposed to know about. Not the scandals that find their way into the tabloids eventually, not the feuds that leak through biographers and unnamed sources, and the careful, deniable briefings of competing press offices. Those things, as damaging as they sometimes are, exist within a kind of managed chaos that the palace has had decades to develop protocols for. There are systems for those. There are people whose entire job is to contain them. What I'm talking about is different. I'm talking about the moments that happen in hallways and private rooms and quiet afternoon hours at royal residences, when no one is on duty and no one is performing, and the machinery of image management is momentarily switched off. The moments that are witnessed by only 2 or 3 people and that never become official, never become documented, never enter the public record in any form, but that change things, that shift something fundamental in the private architecture of a family that has been holding itself together through sheer force of will and tradition and institutional discipline for longer than most nations have existed. This is one of those moments. Before we go any further, I want to be transparent about something, because this story touches on real people, real grief, and real history, and it deserves that transparency. What you are about to hear is built from a foundation of documented public record, verified royal history, and the kind of informed, analytical speculation that serious students of this family engage in when the official account goes silent. This is commentary. This is interpretation. It is not a claim of insider access, and it should not be received as confirmed fact. The palace will not comment. It never does. But the silence itself, as we'll discover, tells us more than most official statements ever could. Now, let's talk about the ring. It is a winter afternoon at Windsor. The castle, even to those who know it well, has a quality at this time of year that is difficult to fully describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The light dies early and theatrically, as though the sky has made a deliberate decision. The corridors feel longer. The rooms that face the wrong direction go dim by 2:30, and in those rooms the sense of history, of all the centuries that have pressed themselves into the stones and the woodwork and the fabrics, is almost tangible. It is not a gloomy feeling, exactly. It is more the feeling of weight, of depth, of being somewhere that has absorbed so much that the walls themselves seem to have opinions. The gathering that brought the family together this particular afternoon was not a state occasion. Those events have their own gravity, their own choreography, their own layer of professional management that ensures everyone is where they're supposed to be, doing what they're supposed to do, presenting the face that the occasion requires. This was something more domestic than that. A routine convergence of family members who share not only blood and history, but the practical geography of a life, lived across several official residences. The kind of visit that happens often and is noted by no one outside the immediate household. Princess Anne had arrived, as she tends to arrive everywhere, without ceremony and without fuss. She is, among all the members of this family, the one who most consistently refuses the gravitational pull of her own status. She does not drift through rooms expecting them to rearrange themselves around her. She moves through a space with the directional efficiency of someone who has always had somewhere to be, and has never particularly cared whether anyone noticed her getting there. It is one of the things that people who know her consistently remark upon: the lack of performance, the absence of the particular kind of self-consciousness that seems, in this family, almost genetically transmitted. She was not looking for anything. That is the detail that matters most, and it is the first thing you should hold in your mind as this story unfolds. She was not on a mission. She was not conducting an inventory. She was moving through the private quarters of the residence with the easy familiarity of someone who has been coming to this place since childhood, for whom these rooms have the unremarkable quality of the known and the long-established. A door was open. She passed through a space that was not, under normal circumstances, her space to be in, and she saw it. It was sitting on the surface of a dressing table, just sitting there, the way personal objects sit when someone has taken them off without thinking and set them down in the uncalculated way of daily life. Not displayed, not protected, not hidden, simply present in the way that belonging to someone makes things present, naturally, unremarkably, as though the surface it rested on had always expected it. Anne stopped. Later, much later, in the fractured, indirect way that knowledge of this kind travels through a family like this, Those who were told about this moment would describe the quality of her stillness in that doorway. Not alarm exactly, not the sharp physical jolt of the genuinely startled. Something slower and colder than that. The kind of stillness that comes when the mind outpaces the body, when recognition is instantaneous and complete, but the rest of the self takes several seconds to catch up with what the mind has already understood. She crossed the room. She picked it up. Now, you have to understand something about Princess Anne that is easy to miss in the public presentation of her. The efficient, no-nonsense exterior, the dry wit, the barely concealed impatience with the more theatrical aspects of royal life that have made her, over the decades, something of a cult figure among people who prefer their royals unvarnished. What that exterior can obscure is the depth and specificity of her memory. She is, by all the accounts of those who know her, extraordinarily precise in her recollections. Not sentimental, that is not the word, and she would likely reject it sharply, but exact. She remembers things in full, in detail, with the particular texture of the moment preserved rather than smoothed over by the passage of time. And she remembered this ring. The memory arrived fully formed, the way certain memories do when they're triggered by the right object, the right shape, the right weight, the right particular quality of light catching a surface in a specific way. She was back in a different room, in a different residence, in a year that felt simultaneously very close and impossibly distant. She was watching Diana, watching her hands, the way you notice someone's hands when they're doing something ordinary, reaching for something, gesturing mid-sentence, resting on a table, and the ring was there, on Diana's finger, in that memory. Exactly this ring, she would have known it anywhere, not only from its appearance but from the story attached to it. There was something about this particular piece, a specific detail of its setting, or a small mark on the band that had been there since before she ever saw it on Diana's hand, that made it unambiguous. This was not a ring that merely resembled Diana's. This was Diana's ring. She turned it over once, then she set it back down, in precisely the position she had found it, and she left the room. She did not take it with her. She did not confront Camilla. She did not call anyone on her phone. She walked back through the corridor, back into the parts of the residence where other members of the family were moving through the afternoon, and she carried the knowledge alone. This is the thing about Anne that separates her from almost every other character in this story. She is disciplined in a way that goes beyond training, beyond upbringing, beyond the institutional conditioning that shapes all of them to some degree. The discipline is constitutive. It is not what she has learned to do, it is what she is. And so rather than react, rather than allow the shock, which was real and which was substantial, to express itself in any visible way, she went very quiet inside herself, and she began to think. The first question was the simplest, and she answered it quickly. Was she certain? She turned the memory over, examined it from every angle, tested its reliability. She asked herself whether she was projecting, whether the desire to recognize had manufactured a recognition that wasn't actually there. She rejected that possibility. She was certain. She had been certain from the first moment she had held it, and the subsequent examination had only deepened that certainty rather than introducing doubt. The second question was harder. How? How does something that belonged to Diana end up here? Not in a vault, not in a documented inventory, not in the possession of William or Harry, Diana's sons, the people for whom her personal effects were most obviously and naturally intended, not stored somewhere and forgotten about, the way things in large family estates can be stored and forgotten. But here, in the private quarters of the woman who, and history records this, the public record is unambiguous about this, was the third presence in the marriage that Diana described, on television, to 80 million people, as having been too crowded. There are only so many ways a thing can travel from one person to another. It can be given. It can be found after a death and allocated by those responsible for the estate. It can be purchased, though that particular possibility strains credulity in this specific case for reasons that are immediately obvious. Or it can pass through channels that exist outside the formal processes, quietly, without documentation, in the way that things sometimes move between people in relationships that have their own private economy, their own reciprocal logic, their own history of exchanges that never enter any official record. Anne did not settle on an answer to this question immediately. She was not sure she needed to. The how was a secondary concern. The primary concern was, what does this mean, and what do I do with what I know? She spent the remainder of that afternoon doing what she always does when processing something she is not ready to act on. She was present, engaged. She moved through the social mechanics of the family gathering with the practiced competence of someone who has been performing those mechanics at a high level for 70+ years, and she gave nothing away. If anyone in that room sensed something in her, some slight extra quality of stillness, some marginal shift in the frequency of her attention, they did not show it. That night, alone, she made her decision. She would go to Charles. Not immediately, not the next morning, in the raw and insufficient hours before anyone has fully assembled themselves for the day. She would choose her moment, the way careful people choose their moments, with full awareness of the weight of what she was about to set in motion, and the equal awareness that not setting it in motion was no longer an option she could live with. She had seen what she had seen. She knew what she knew. And whatever the consequences, whatever disruptions were introduced into the already complex equilibrium of this family, allowing this to remain unacknowledged was something she was not prepared to do. 3 decades, nearly, had passed since Diana died. 3 decades of the family finding its new shape around her absence. Charles remarrying, legitimizing what had always been the open secret of that marriage's failure, installing Camilla first as Duchess of Cornwall and eventually as Queen Consort, watching the public reception of that transition shift from hostility to something resembling acceptance, if never quite to warmth. The process had been managed with the grinding, methodical patience that this institution brings to every problem that threatens it. Small moves, long timelines, an incremental normalization that relies on the human tendency, over long enough periods, to simply accept the current arrangement as the natural one. And through all of it, Diana's memory had been carefully, selectively maintained. Her photograph in William's locket, her name spoken at anniversaries, the acknowledgement, always carefully worded, always maintained within precise parameters, that she had been extraordinary, that she had mattered, that her sons loved her and carried her with them. It is a tribute structure that manages grief and reputation simultaneously, that honors the dead without disturbing the living. It works, up to a point. The ring disturbs it. Because what the ring suggests, if Anne's certainty is warranted, and every available indication is that it is that the separation between Diana's world and Camilla's world, which the family has maintained so carefully in the public narrative, may not be as complete in private as it has always been presented. It suggests the possibility of things passing between those two worlds without acknowledgement, without consent from those who had the greatest right to consent, without the transparency that Diana's sons, who have spent their adult lives negotiating the painful terrain of their mother's legacy, might reasonably have expected. It reopens everything. That is the terrible efficiency of a discovery like this. It does not just raise one question, it raises all the prior questions that were never quite fully answered, that were buried under the accumulation of time and new circumstances, and the sheer pragmatic necessity of moving forward. It brings them back to the surface, one by one, with the particular freshness that things have when they are suddenly relevant again after years of dormancy. She went to him 2 days later. Charles was in his study, one of the rooms that had always been his in the way that certain rooms in these large residences quietly become specific to specific people over time, absorbing their habits and preferences until they seem almost to take the shape of the person who uses them most. Books, papers, the quiet objects of a private intellectual life that exists alongside the public one. It was a room Anne had been in many times, across many decades, for many different conversations, some of them easy, some of them not. She knew the room, she knew her brother, and she had decided, somewhere in the private deliberation of those 2 days, exactly what she was going to say, and precisely how she was going to say it. She closed the door. What followed was not a confrontation in any theatrical sense. It was not raised voices or broken composure or any of the things that the more overheated corners of royal commentary would reach for instinctively. This is not that family, and it is not those people. What it was, and this is what makes it, in its own way, far more devastating than any amount of operatic drama would have been, was a very quiet, very controlled, very precisely worded conversation between two people who have known each other for their entire lives and who understand, both of them, with great sophistication, the weight of the words they are choosing. She told him what she had found. She did not ask him whether she was right, because she was not looking for his confirmation of something she had already confirmed for herself. She told him, "I saw the ring, Charles. I know which ring it is, I know where it came from, and I need you to tell me how it came to be where I found it." The room was very quiet. Charles, in public, is a man who has mastered the art of the considered response. Decades of scrutiny have refined this skill to an extraordinary degree. The thoughtful pause, the measured sentence, the expression that conveys engagement and seriousness without committing to any specific emotional territory. He has been trained by his entire life in the management of public presence. He knows how to fill a silence with words that contain very little, and how to fill a silence with a look that communicates everything while remaining technically deniable. But this was not public, and Anne was not the public. She watched his face. She had been watching his face her entire life. She had watched it across negotiating tables and family dinners and state occasions and private crises, across the full range of everything that 70-plus years of shared family life produces. And she knew his face the way you only know the face of someone who has been present for all of it. She could read it in a register that no press photographer, no biographer, no interviewer had ever had access to. What she saw was not guilt, exactly. It was something more complicated than guilt, and in some ways, more distressing. It was the expression of a man for whom a specific, carefully managed interior compartment has been suddenly opened from the outside. A man confronted with something he has kept in a sealed space for so long that the opening of it is almost physically painful. She saw him absorb what she had said. She saw him understand that she was not guessing, not fishing, not working from rumor or incomplete information. She saw him understand that she knew. And then she saw him go completely still. He did not explain, not in any form she found satisfying, not in any form that approached the clarity she had come to him asking for. What he offered instead, and this silence dressed up in the clothes of a response, is the thing that those who came to know about this conversation found most revealing, was a quality of speechlessness that was itself a kind of answer. Not the speechlessness of a man who has been falsely accused and is struggling to articulate his defense. The speechlessness of a man who has been accurately seen and who does not yet know, or cannot yet decide, what to do with that. There was something in his eyes, in the lines of his face, in the way his hands went very still in his lap. Something that looked, to the person who knew him well enough to read it, like an old grief, like a wound that had been managed rather than healed, kept functional, kept from interfering with the business of his life, but never actually resolved. The ring had touched it. Anne's discovery had reached inside the compartment and touched the thing that lived there, and whatever that thing was, whatever complex amalgam of love and guilt and loss and self-justification, comprised the emotional reality of what Charles had felt about Diana in the decades since her death, it was there in his face, in that room, legible to his sister in a way it would never be legible to anyone outside that door. He said enough, eventually, that the conversation could technically end. Not enough that Anne left with answers. Not enough that she left with anything resembling resolution or understanding or the clean, solid ground that she had come there seeking. She left with more certainty than she had arrived with. The certainty that his silence was not the silence of a man with a simple explanation he was struggling to articulate, but the silence of a man for whom the question itself had complicated consequences she was not yet fully able to map. She was not the only one who would eventually come to know about this. In a family like this, in any family really, but especially in one where proximity is managed so carefully, where the household staff are long-serving and perceptive, and see far more than they are ever acknowledged to see, where information travels through the specific channels of shared domestic life, rather than through the official channels that can be monitored and managed, these things move. Not to the press, not initially, perhaps not ever, but between the people who need to know, between the people who are part of the emotional infrastructure of the family, who have the standing to be brought in, whose reactions and responses matter. William came to know. The specific mechanism of how and when and in what form is something that lives entirely within the private world of these people. But he came to know. And here is where we need to spend some time, because William's relationship to any information about Diana, any new fragment, any fresh complication, anything that touches on the story of her life and her death and the aftermath of both, is not a simple thing, has never been a simple thing. Cannot be a simple thing for a man who was 15 years old when his mother died in a Paris tunnel, who was walked behind her coffin in front of the whole world, who has spent more than half of his life building a version of himself that can function and lead and be present for his own children while carrying that. He does not erupt, William. He never has. Even as a young man, in the early years after Diana's death, when the press was at its most invasive and the pressure was at its most relentless, his emotional register was always internal. It compresses rather than expands under pressure. The anger, if that's even the right word, the grief, the injury, whatever it is that sits underneath the composed exterior, turns inward and becomes something harder and more lasting than outburst. He has described it himself, in those rare and careful interviews where he has allowed any of it to be visible, as a weight, as something you carry, as something that is always there, even when you are not thinking about it, even when you are going about the ordinary business of being a husband and a father and a future king. The ring reached him. In whatever form the news arrived, through whatever sequence of conversations it traveled, the ring found William. And what it did to him, whatever specific reaction it produced, whatever conversation happened between him and Catherine in the privacy of their own home, belongs to the sealed interior of his life. But those who know him describe the particular quality he takes on when something directly connected to his mother surfaces unexpectedly. The going still, the turning inward, the face that becomes, paradoxically, more controlled at precisely the moments when the interior is least controlled. Catherine is important here, and not in a way that is often sufficiently acknowledged. She is the person who has watched William navigate this territory more closely than anyone. She has been present for the anniversaries, for the moments when a photograph surfaces, or a documentary airs, or a journalist publishes something, and the air in their home changes without either of them having to say anything. She has developed, through years of that proximity, a finely calibrated sensitivity to what Diana's presence, even in memory, even in the form of a piece of news or a new detail, does to her husband. She knows what to do and what not to do, what helps and what doesn't, when to be present, and when to give him the space to process alone. And she has her own relationship to Diana's memory. Not the raw grief of a son, but something real nonetheless. The relationship of a woman who never met her mother-in-law, who raises 3 children whom that woman will never know, who has tried, with genuine care and thoughtfulness, to keep Diana present for those children in a way that is honest and loving and not shaped by the complications of institutional history. She has spoken about this. Not directly, not at length, not in the way that people who have been burned often decline to speak directly at length, but enough to make clear that it matters, that Diana matters, that the care with which Diana's memory is tended is not merely a political or institutional project, but a personal one. The ring is a complication of that project, because what the family has tried to build, in the years since the raw hostility of the immediate post-Diana period, in the decades of painstaking rehabilitation and reinvention that have brought the monarchy to whatever standing it currently occupies, is a kind of peace between the two histories. The Charles and Camilla history, the Charles and Diana history, a narrative arrangement in which both are true, both are acknowledged, both are given their appropriate weight, and neither is weaponized against the other. It is a fragile arrangement. It has always been fragile. It requires a continuous, active maintenance of boundaries, of what is said and what is not said, of what is acknowledged and what is kept private. The ring, sitting on that dressing table, crosses a boundary. There are those who will immediately reach for the most charitable interpretation, who will argue that there is a simple, innocuous explanation for how an item belonging to Diana came to be in Camilla's possession. Perhaps it was allocated formally, and the documentation simply hasn't been seen by those now asking the question. Perhaps it was a gift, made by someone with the standing to make it, at some point in the complex history of this family's post-Diana reorganization. Perhaps there is a chain of custody that is entirely legitimate and entirely explainable, and the only reason it has not been explained is that no one has yet been asked the right question in the right way. These interpretations are available. They may even be correct. The charitable reading of the evidence is always available, and in dealing with a family whose private life is almost entirely inaccessible to genuine scrutiny, the charitable reading carries real weight. But charitable interpretations do not account for Charles's silence. They do not explain why a man who, if the explanation were simple and innocent, would have produced that simple and innocent explanation immediately, who would have had every reason to produce it, every incentive to clear the air, instead went still in a way that his sister, who has known him for his entire life, found more alarming than any protestation of innocence could have been. The silence is the thing, not the ring, finally, the silence. It speaks to something about the interior life of this family that its members have always known but that those outside it can only infer from the accumulated evidence of decades. Which is that the private truths, the ones that live in sealed compartments, in the architecture of self-justification that any human being builds around the parts of their history they are least able to confront cleanly, are sometimes worse than the worst speculation, not because of what they contain necessarily, but because of the simple, suffocating, inescapable fact of their existence, the weight of the things that are known but unspoken, the cost of maintaining that weight, year after year, while the world watches and speculates and the official account is kept immaculate. Diana has been dead for nearly 3 decades. 3 decades, and she is still capable of doing this, of walking back into a room at Windsor on a winter afternoon, not in person, but in the form of a ring on a dressing table, and stopping the people who knew her in their tracks. Still capable of producing the silence that falls when Charles Windsor is confronted with something he cannot easily explain. Still capable of making Princess Anne weep, not in public, not for the cameras, but in the quiet of wherever she went after she left that study. Because she did weep, eventually. Not in the room with Charles. She would not have allowed herself that in front of him. Not in that context. Not in the middle of a conversation whose strategic importance required her to remain clear-headed and precise. But somewhere, later, in the private hours that are finally her own, the weight of what she had seen, and what it connected to, found its way through the control. Not a performance, not a collapse, a release, specific and brief, of the grief and frustration and sadness that had been compressed since the moment she'd picked up the ring and known it for what it was. She had loved Diana. Not simply, not without complication. Theirs was never the straightforward warmth of 2 women who had chosen each other. The complications of the marriage, the pressures of the institution, the generational differences in how they understood their roles, all of these had made the relationship difficult at times, distant at others. But beneath all of that was something real, a genuine seeing of each other, across the gap of a situation that made seeing difficult. A mutual recognition that had its own weight and its own history, and someone had taken something that was Diana's, and it was sitting on a dressing table at Windsor, and no one had said a word. The story does not end here. These stories never end here. They go underground, into the private world of a family that is very practiced at the management of things that cannot be resolved quickly or cleanly, and they continue moving, slowly and without public visibility, through the channels of that family's interior life. Something has shifted. Something has been introduced into the equilibrium of this particular chapter of the Windsor story that was not there before. Whether it surfaces again, and in what form, and with what consequences for the relationships and the trust that have been built, laboriously and imperfectly, across the last 25 years, these are questions that belong to the future. What we can say is that Anne knows, Charles knows that she knows, and William, in whatever form the information reached him, carries a new piece of a puzzle that he has been assembling, without ever quite completing, since he was 15 years old. There is a particular quality to the unanswered questions that surround this family, a quality that distinguishes them from the unanswered questions surrounding any ordinary set of people. They are not just personal, they are historical. They will eventually become documented, in whatever partial and disputed form the documentation of royal life always takes, in biographies written by those with some access, in memoirs published by those who were present, in the slow declassification of what was private into what is merely past. Future generations will read about this family the way we read about the courts of Henry VIII or the domestic life of Victoria, with the peculiar intimacy that history confers on people who had no idea they were being recorded for it. And among the things they will read about, eventually, are the things that happened in the quiet moments. The afternoon at Windsor, the ring on the dressing table, the study with the books and the papers, and the man who went very still when his sister told him what she had found. Those things will find their way into the record. They always do. But right now, they exist in the place where all the most significant truths about this family exist, in the sealed space between what is known and what is said, in the silence that has been falling, reliably and instructively, across the decades of this family's private drama, in the expression on a king's face in a room where only his sister was watching. What Anne does next, what Charles does with his silence, what William does with what he knows, whether any of it ever moves from the private world into even a semi-public acknowledgement, is the question that this story leaves open. It may be answered. It may never be answered. The House of Windsor has proven, across its long and improbable history, that it has an almost limitless capacity for absorbing unresolved things, for continuing to function, to present, to endure, while the unsealed compartments of its interior life slowly accumulate their contents. But sometimes, one thing is too much. Sometimes the ring on the dressing table is the thing that finally makes the capacity insufficient. Sometimes, the silence is so loud that even the most disciplined people, the most controlled family, the most practiced institution in the world, cannot simply continue to maintain it. We are watching to see which of those this is. Stay close, because when the next piece moves, and in this family, the next piece always moves, you will want to be here for it.